Today's reading will be Popkin, Chapter 2, pages 19 through 30, in the book A Short History of the French Revolution, 6th edition. Starting Chapter 2, The Collapse of the Absolute Monarchy, 1787 through 1789. France in the mid-1780s was a society afflicted with numerous tensions. Nevertheless, it was not obvious that the country was on the brink of a revolutionary explosion, despite the economic difficulties that the 1770s and 1780s. Most peasants were better off than their ancestors under Louis XIV. Successful members of the bourgeoisie continued to enrich themselves and find ways to gain noble status. The questioning of traditional values had not given rise to any organized subversive movements. Repeated political crises had tested the institutions of absolutism, but each time the monarchy had emerged intact. Long-term trends had made a major crisis in France possible, but it took a specific set of events to make it unavoidable. The pre-revolution. The most important of the events leading to a revolution was the fact that by the late 1786, the French government was finally on the verge of complete insolvency. Charles Alexander de Calonne, Controller General since 1783, had initially won his job because he promised that he could deal with the monarchy's financial problems without proposing controversial reforms. He had tried to keep his promises by engaging in a number of risky financial gambles, many of which increased France's foreign debts and reinforced criticism of the government's management of the economy. He finally found himself having to persuade Louis XIV of the necessity for extraordinary measures to head off bankruptcy. The immediate problem was the need to repay loans floated to fund France's participation in the American War of Independence. The fiscal crisis was thus directly linked to the effort to maintain France's role as a world power. But Calonne now advised Louis XIV that the only way to bring real order into the finances is to revitalize the entire state by reforming all that is defective in its constitution. Convinced that he could not accomplish his aims through the normal institutions of the monarchy, Calonne took the first step that was to lead a revolution. He persuaded the king to convoke an assembly of notables to discuss fundamental changes in the structure of French government. The convocation of the Assembly of Notables in January 1787 was the first of a series of events that historians have come to label the pre-revolution. During this period, which lasted from the beginning of 1787 until the meeting of the Estates General in May 1789, the formal powers of the king and his ministers remained intact, and their bureaucratic machine continued to go through its regular routines. The authority of the absolutist state had not yet completely broken down, but it was rapidly eroding. In their efforts to escape from the looming shadow of bankruptcy, Calonne and his successors proposed more and more drastic reforms, throwing into question more and more of France's traditional institutions. By raising so many controversial issues, these initiatives galvanized ever wider circles of the population into organized political action, until the king's call for nationwide elections to the Estates General extended the process of politicization to every single town and village in France. The great mid-20th century French historian Georges Lefebvre labeled the pre-revolution an aristocratic revolution because the most vocal opposition to the royal reform initiatives during this period came from members of France's titled elite rather than from the representatives of the bourgeoisie and the lower class, who were to take leading roles in events from 1789 onward. Lefebvre and other historians of the Marxist school interpreted the activity of aristocratic leaders during the pre-revolution as the culmination of longer process of feudal reaction in effort by the land-owning class threatened by the development of capitalism and an aggressive bourgeoisie to shore up its slipping economic and social positions. More recent scholars have questioned the reality of this feudal reaction. Nobles continue to look out for their economic interests, as they always had, but there is little evidence that this process had become more intense just before 1789, or that the most nobles thought their position was in danger. The judges of the parliament and other aristocrats who challenged royal authority during the pre-revolution were reacting primarily to a political threat. Like the royal ministers whom they opposed, they also recognized the need for major reforms. But they argued that the discredited absolutist system could not be trusted to remake itself. They opposed measures that they feared would increase ministerial power and insisted that the French nation be consulted about fundamental changes in its constitution, and they saw themselves as the natural spokesman for the rest of the population. The Assembly of Notables. By convening an assembly of carefully chosen noblemen, clergy, and high officials to examine his reform proposals, Calonne believed that he could enlist the force of public opinion in favor of his proposals. He wanted a new land tax that would be paid by all property owners, nobles, clergy, and commoners, and the establishment of representative assemblies in all of France's provinces. The land tax implied the abolition of privileges that had set the nobles and clergy apart from the rest of the population. The provincial assemblies undermined that the fundamental principle of absolutism, that authority should flow from the top down. Calonne promised that his proposals would benefit all classes of the population and told the notables, surely no selfish interest will oppose the general interest. But the 142 delegates who arrived in Versailles in February 1787 reacted to Calonne's project with suspicion. Since taking office in 1783, Calonne had borrowed and spent freely, insisting the royal finances were healthy. Now he had suddenly reversed his course, announcing that the treasury was empty and asking for new taxes. Few of the notables were prepared to believe his claims without verification. Before they endorsed proposals that would overturn long-standing traditions and weaken their special privileges, they demanded a precise accounting of government revenue and expenditures. Calonne responded by appealing to the public. He had his proposals printed together with an introduction condemning the notables for their defense of outmoded privileges. But the population was not ready to rally to support of the notoriously high-handed minister against the notables, who cast themselves as defenders of the people's traditional legal rights. By April 1787, it was clear that Calonne's gamble had failed. Louis XVI replaced him with one of his chief critics among the notables, the Archbishop of Toulouse, Loménie de Brienne. Brienne found the assemblies of notables equally difficult to work with. However, its members had made it increasingly clear that they would not take the responsibility for approving new taxes. The most outspoken of them challenged the government to convene an elected assembly representing all elements of the population. The Estates General of the realm, which had not met since 1614. Brienne was reluctant to make such a complete departure from the policies of absolutism. Instead, he sought to get the parliaments to approve modified versions of Cologne's proposals. Implementation of the plan for provincial assemblies and the creation of new municipal council began, giving local elites a first taste of participatory politics. By a combination of concessions and pressure, Breen worked out a delicate compromise with the parliaments. In return for their approval of an extension of tax surcharges imposed during the American War, Breen promised to convoke the Estates General in 1792, by which time he calculated that the worst of the government's fiscal problems would be solved. When the Paris Parliament met on 19th November 1787 to ratify his plan, however, Louis XVI upset all of his ministers' hard work. Instead of allowing judges of the Parliament to discuss it freely, as they had been promised, the king ordered them to register it without a vote. It is legal because I wish it, he insisted, reasserting the basic premise of the absolutist government. His unexpected intervention outraged the judges and much of the public. Compromise with the parliaments having failed, Breen and his fellow ministers decided on a policy of confrontation. On 8 May 1788, they promulgated a set of edicts that abolished the parliaments, replacing them with a single high court for the whole country. They accompanied this radical measure with other reforms designed to make the elimination of the parliaments more palatable to public opinion, such as the abolition of the fees that litigants had to pay to judges to have their cases heard. But these did little to soften the shock of their actions, which revived the fear of an all-powerful despotism raised by Chancellor Maupeou's efforts to remodel parliaments in 1770 to 1771. The country was flooded with pamphlets that restated the traditional parliamentary or magisterial themes that need to restore a balance in the Constitution by limiting royal authority. From failed reforms to revolutionary crisis. The attempt to abolish the Parliament opened a debate that went beyond the issues of new taxes or court reform. Issues now was the question of who had the sovereign power to make fundamental laws for the kingdom. Supporters of the parliaments maintained that this power could be exercised only by the nation itself, not by the king and his ministers. Inspired in part by the examples of England and the United States, these protesters demanded a reform of representative government for France. French historical tradition offered a model of such body. The Estates General, a body of representatives chosen from the three traditional estates with the power to represent grievances to the king and consent to taxes. As the resistance to the abolition of the parliaments and the demands for a representative assembly mounted, the king and his ministers finally saw no alternative to convening the Estates General. Royal authority was breaking down in several provinces, notably in Dauphine, where 7 June 1788, the Day of Tiles, pro-parliament rioters hurling stones from rooftops drove royal troops out of the city of Grenoble in the first outbreak of the political violence that would mark the revolution. On July 5th, 1788, to answer these protests, Breen announced that the Estates General would be convened as soon as possible. He also suspended the censorship laws, allowing free public discussion of public matters. This announcement weakened government authority even further. By early August, the treasury was virtually empty, and Breen had to resign in favor for the former minister Jacques Necker, who had a reputation as a reformer. His appointment, together with the recall of parliaments, produced a temporary calming effect, allowing the elections of deputies to Estates General to proceed. Preparations for the Estates General took place in the middle of a serious economic and social crisis. Many French manufacturers and workers were suffering from the effects of free trade treaty with England that Cologne had negotiated in 1786. In July 1788, a catastrophic hailstorm damaged grain crops across northern France, sending bread prices soaring as merchants anticipated a bad harvest. The Archbishop of Paris, the Royal Society of Agriculture, and even the king, who announced the creation of a special lottery to raise money for the poor, tried to reassure the public that there was no hiding the fact that the country faced its most threatening subsistence crisis in decades. The worsening economic conditions created an atmosphere of social unrest that added a sense of urgency to the meeting of the Estates General. The meeting of Estates General. The summoning of Estates General raised a new and divisive question. How was the assembly to be organized? In previous centuries, the Estates General had met in 3 separate chambers representing respectively the clergy and the nobility, and the third estate, or commoners. All 3 chambers had to agree before the Estate General can pass any resolution. Under these laws, the 2 privileged estates, the clergy and the nobles, who collectively amounted to less than 3% of the population, could dominate the proceedings. The perspectives suited many of those who saw arbitrary authority as the country's main problem. They saw the nobles, particularly the aristocratic judges of the parliament, as the natural leaders of the nation and its protectors against the king's arbitrary power. On September 25, 1788, the newly restored Paris Parliament explicitly ordered that the Estates General meet according to the forms of 1614, that is, with 3 orders meeting and voting separately. The judges were probably concerned primarily with preventing the government from setting its own rules for the meeting. But the effect of their edict was to change the main focus of political debate. Arguments between the supporters and opponents of royal authority gave way to heated disputes between defenders of the aristocracy and the politically articulate member of the Third Estate, who now feared that their interests would be ignored at the upcoming assembly. The Parliament's decree also caused protests in France's colonies, which had not existed in 1614. Wealthy plantation owners insisted that they were too important to France's economy to be left unrepresented. Movements in the provinces offered 2 different models of relationships between the privileged orders and Third Estate. In Dauphine, reformers under the leadership of a lawyer named Joseph Mounier drafted a plan to restore its long-dormant estates in the form of a single assembly in which half of the deputies would be chosen by 2 privileged orders and half by the Third Estate. They defended their plan on the grounds that, like the English Constitution, it would ensure harmony among the 3 estates by giving the privileged orders a stake in the new system. Events in Brittany pointed in a very different direction. In this province, dominated by impoverished petty noblemen who feared seeing themselves displaced by wealthy urban commoners such as the wealthy merchants of the port city in Nantes, the privileged orders rejected any concession to the Third Estate. Their opponents countered by arguing the Third Estate to claim more authority for itself. In December and January, violence flared in the streets of Reims, the provincial capital, as supporters and opponents of the nobility battled each other. The Breton Third Estate's argument against the privileged orders was transferred to the national level, in which is the most influential pamphlets written in the late fall of 1788. The Abbé Sieyès' What is the Third Estate? Sieyès began a ringing declaration. The plan of this work is very simple. We have 3 questions to ask. First, what is the Third Estate? Everything. Second, what has it been to the political order up to now? Nothing. Third, what does it demand? To become something. The Third Estate, Sieyès asserted, has within itself all that is necessary to constitute a complete nation. Since its members did all the useful work in the country, if privileged order were abolished, he concluded, the nation would not be something less but something more. He called for a single assembly representing those who made real contributions to the public welfare, from the humble peasant to the wealthy merchant and learned lawyer. This group, Sieyès maintained, had a single common interest. It is the nation. Its representatives had every right to proceed on their own, disregarding any objections of the deputies from the privileged orders. Other pamphleters, such as the Protestant minister Rabat Saint Etienne, seconded Say's arguments and added their own. Rabat, for example, urged his readers to not to follow the conduct of your ancestors, but to be guided by good sense and the law of nature. As the elections to the Estate General proceeded in the first 4 months of 1789, comprised between the privileged order of the Third Estate, still seemed possible. A second assembly of notables held in November and December of 1788 rejected proposals that would have given the Third Estate more influence, but Necker managed to get Louis XVI to take more conciliatory line by demanding the doubling of the third on December 27, 1788. As in Dauphins assembly, the commoners would elect twice as many deputies as each of the other two orders. The decree dodged the question whether the 600 deputies from the Third Estate and 300 from each of the other two orders would meet together in a single assembly or in a separate chambers, in which the Third Estate's number would be meaningless. The elections to the States General transformed the notion of the government according to the public opinion from an abstract slogan into a living reality. In every parish and district in the country, all adult men and, in exceptional cases, a few women were called together not only to choose representatives, but also to voice their views on what issues the Estate General should consider by drawing up cahiers de la doléance, or list of grievances. The cahiers provided a complex and ambiguous picture of the population's concern on the eve of the Revolution. All three orders, cahiers indicated a consensus in favor of major constitutional reforms, above all the creation of a system of representative government that would limit the king's powers. The nobility and clergy were ready to accept some major modifications of their privileges, such as the equality of taxation. There were a strong sentiment for reform of the legal system, and most nobles joined the Third Estate in favoring abolition of censorship. The nobility's cahiers hardly foresaw the complete abolition of their order. However, the clergy opposed the creation of essentially secular society. Cahiers representing peasants' villages mixed appeals for broad reform with local concerns, calling for repair of bridges, abolition of specific tolls and dues, and measures against specific privilege holders, such as the postmaster of the village of economy, whose neighbors complained that he was evading taxes. Taken as a whole, they represented a serious protest against the working of the seigneurial system and the privileges of the nobility. As deputies from the villages came together to elect regional representatives, members of the urban Third Estate, usually bourgeoisie lawyers, office holders, and other professionals, reworked these demands, giving them a more general form. Even so, the Third Estate cahiers were still something less than a revolutionary program. They revealed strong dissatisfaction with existing conditions and a widespread demand for the end of many special privileges, but they did not call for the elimination of social distinctions or the abolition of the monarchy. The summoning of the Estates General raised special controversies in France's colonies, where white colonists feared that the campaign for liberty in France itself would lead to an attack on slavery. Some colonists demanded the right to elect deputies to the Estates General to protect their interests, while the cahiers were generally moderate in tone and content. The lifting of censorship and the general atmosphere of excitement encouraged the circulation of pamphlets that demanded more radical reforms, sometimes in violent language. This pamphlet literature showed that the cautious compromises would not satisfy the public's hunger for real change. The Parliamentary Revolution. On May 3rd, 1789, the approximately 1,200 deputies to the Estates General assembled in Versailles. Some were already well known because of their role in the public debates that had occupied the country ever since Cologne had convoked his assembly of nobles more than 2 years earlier, whereas others were obscure parish priests, provincial noblemen, and small-town lawyers. Contrary to the allegations of the critics then and since, many of the members of the Third Estate had practical experience in public affairs as royal officials, in local government, and as administrators in the church. Among the assembled deputies, there was an articulate minority of self-proclaimed patriots bent on sweeping transformation of French public life. Their program included a fixed, written constitution for France that would severely limit the king's powers, the abolition of legal privileges, a representative assembly, and a declaration of rights that would guarantee religious toleration and press freedom. Many of the Patriots' leaders were also members of the Society of Friends of the Blacks, an organization founded in 1788 to oppose slavery. The society was one of the first groups to introduce the language of natural rights into political debates. Initially, however, most of the deputies rejected the Patriots' radicalism and looked for leadership to Louis XVI, whose general popularity had soared since he agreed to the convocation of the Estates General and to the chief minister, Necker. Necker's budgetary wizardry, the deputies assumed, would produce a solution to the fiscal crisis. Unfortunately for the monarchy, the king and Necker proved unprepared for the extraordinary situation they now found themselves in. Louis, an honest and well-meaning man, lacked the vision and determination to take the lead in the radical reform movement. Necker had little sense of how to handle a crisis. Charged with presenting the government's program to the Estates General in its opening session, he exhausted the deputies' patience with a long-winded account on the monarchy's fiscal problems, but offered them no specific proposals to debate. The king and Necker left the Estates General itself to decide the burning question on whether to vote head by head or by order. With no commitment to significant reform from the king, the deputies of the Third Estate had every reason to fear that the subsequent proceedings would be dominated by the two privileges orders. This fear drove even the moderate members of the Third Estate to support a radical decision. The Third Estate immediately paralyzed the assembly by refusing to organize itself and begin work unless the two orders agreed to meet and vote in common. The underlying issue was fundamental. Was France to become a country of citizens enjoying equal rights, or was it to remain divided into groups with differing privileges? On June 10th, after 5 weeks of futile negotiations with the other orders, the Third Estate deputies had become sufficiently impatient to endorse a radical suggestion from the Abbé Sieyès. The Third Estate sent final invitation to the nobles and the clergy to form a single assembly, announcing that it would proceed without them if they declined. Joined by a handful of deputies from the clergy, the Third Estate deputies voted on June 17th, 1789, renamed themselves the National Assembly, thus proclaiming that they were speaking for the national community as a whole. News of their actions reached a wider public through the regular letters that many of the deputies sent home, and via hastily created newspapers that summarized the Estate General's debates. In coffee houses and public places throughout the nation, ordinary citizens, living embodiments of the public opinion that had taken on a new level of importance with the monarchy's virtual abdication of power, voiced their support for the deputies. The Third Estate's decision to transform into the National Assembly was a challenge to the authority of Louis XVI, as well as to the other two orders. 3 days later, on June 20th, the king tried to regain control of the situation by calling a special session of all three orders on June 23rd. In the meantime, royal officials locked the deputies of the National Assembly out of the regular meeting hall. Fearing that the king would try to quash their decisions, the members of the assembly held an emergency assembly in the only building that they could find that was large enough to accommodate them, the king's indoor tennis court. There, they swore the dramatic oath of the tennis court, pledging not to cease the meeting until they had given France a new constitution. At royal session on June 3rd, 1789, the king proposed limited reforms, but insisted that the deputies continued their meeting in separate assemblies. When royal officials ordered the deputies to disperse after the king's speech, Count Mirabeau, a patriot nobleman who had been elected to represent the Third Estate on his native province, who had already established himself as one of the nation's National Assembly leaders, defiantly replied, "We are here by the will of the French people, and will be only dispersed by the force of bayonets." Faced with intransigence of the Third Estate deputies, the king was forced to back down. On June 27th, 1789, he himself ordered the deputies of the clergy and nobility to join the National Assembly. The former deputies of the Third Estate seemed to have won, and the National Assembly started to work on a constitution. But the bayonets to which Mirabeau had referred were not out of the picture. The government had begun to assemble troops near the capital. The incipient revolution still risked being put down by force. The storming of the Bastille. While the troops assembled and the deputies debated, the rest of French population intervened to determine the country's fate. The agitation accompanying the elections of the Estates General and the unrest stemming from the difficult economic conditions had already led to popular insurrections in several parts of the country. In March and April, a wave of riots swept the region around Marseille. And in April 1789, artisans and workers in Paris's populous Faubourg Saint-Antoine sacked the mansion of the wallpaper manufacturer Revellion, who had been accused of trying to lower wages. These violent incidents showed the strength of social tensions. Political excitement also ran high. Crowds gathered every day in open spaces like the gardens of Palais Royal to listen to the reports from Versailles and speeches by self-appointed orators. Popular sympathies were overwhelmingly with the leader of the Third Estate and hostile to the aristocrats opposing them. Political agitation affected even the soldiers stationed in and around Paris, some of whom openly expressed their sympathies for the National Assembly. In Versailles, however, the king's most conservative advisors had gained the upper hand. On July 11th, 1789, Louis dismissed Necker, who, in spite of his ineffectual performance at the opening of the States General, had still been regarded as an advocate of reform. Even before the deputies in Versailles could respond to this move, the people in Paris took to the streets in protest. On 12th and 13th of July, as fears grew that the troops ringing the capital would be sent in to put down the patriotic movement, crowds besieged the royal arsenals in the city demanding arms. They also destroyed the tax collection barriers that formed the wall around the city, expressing their determination to demand changes that would make concrete changes in their lives. Meanwhile, army commanders warned Versailles that they could not count on their men to fight against the Parisians. On July 14th, 1789, a large crowd composed primarily of skilled artisans and shopkeepers, aided by soldiers from one of the regiments stationed in the city, surrounded the Bastille, an imposing medieval fortress prison that had become a symbol of despotic authority. Defended by only a few hundred troops and housing only 7 prisoners at the time, the Bastille had little military significance. But when the Parisians, infuriated by the commander's refusal to give up the weapons it contained, stormed and captured it, their victory became an immediate symbol of the newly born popular revolution movement. News of the day's events shocked the king and his advisors, who abandoned any hope of crushing the movement by force. The National Assembly now had the support it needed to move forward, but the deputies recognized that they would have to reckon with their popular allies' demands. The storming of the Bastille was accompanied by the killing of several officials of the old regiment, showing how quickly popular action could turn to violence. The victims' severed heads were carried through the streets in a gory celebration of the popular victory. The reform-minded patriots, leaders who helped set off the insurrection, moved quickly to restore order. However, the committee of electors who had just chosen Paris's deputies to the Estates General turned themselves into an improvised city government, choosing one of their members, the astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, as a mayor. They created a civic militia, the National Guard, to maintain order in the streets. It was put under the command of Lafayette, the reform-minded nobleman, famous for his participation in the American Revolution. From the outset, it was clear that there was a potential cleavage between leaders like Bailey and Lafayette, willing to profit from the success of the popular movement, but determined to keep it under control, and the mass of the population whose directed action was to ensure the revolutionary movement's success, but who were now expected to return quietly to their homes. A similar combination of elite and popular action characterized the wave of revolutionary uprisings that swept over other French cities in July 1789, some before and some after the Parisian events. Crowds assaulted local buildings that symbolized royal authority and forced royal intendants and appointed municipal officials to yield power to improvised councils of men loyal to the National Assembly. This municipal revolt paralyzed the royal administration and transferred responsibility for enforcing the laws of two officials who owed their authority to the support of the local population, thereby reversing several centuries of administrative centralization. Even more threatening to the traditional social order was the wave of peasant violence that followed the storming of the Bastille. In many rural regions, peasants, terrified by rumors that brigands in the pay of aristocratic opponents on the revolution were about to devastate their crops, turned to the manor house of the local nobles in mass movement that became known as the Great Fear. Relatively few nobles were actually killed, but a number of chateaux were burned. More often, the rioting peasants forced local seigneurs to turn over their charters and deeds that consecrated their special privileges. After having broken the locks on my cabinets that held my documents, they burned them in the woods near my chateau. One noble victim complained. The peasants' actions made it clear that they demanded an end to exactions of seigneurial system. The rural insurrection, the largest outbreak of peasant revolt in France in many centuries, completed the breakdown of the royal authority. As a result, the National Assembly had a chance to make important reforms, but the duties of the National Assembly, many of whom were themselves owners of rural property, faced the daunting challenge of restoring orders, not just in Paris, in other towns, but throughout the country. As the authority of the government and nobles dissolved, power shifted to those who declared their loyalty to the assembly and adopted new symbols of the revolution, such as red, white, and blue tricolor cockade that the Paris patriots had created as a badge. This largely spontaneous movement from below ensured the success of the National Assembly and of what now openly called a revolution. In the face of the crowd's actions in Paris, Louis XVI, on July 15th, 1789, announced the recall of troops and the reappointment of Necker. 2 days later, the king traveled to his capital city. Large crowds lined his route and applauded when he accepted the tricolor cockade from Bailey, the new mayor. Louis's action symbolized the reconciliation of the king and his people, once again joined together like a father and his children. But the atmosphere of euphoria and the applause for the monarch could not conceal the fact that the former absolute ruler had to recognize the authority of an official installed by a popular insurrection. Question for reflection. Why was there so much controversy surrounding the question of how the Estates General would conduct its voting in 1789?